standardized testing, PSAT, ACT, and SAT. So we have a very special guest. He has been presenting for our schools for the last few years, and the information is always very well received. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Patrick Hennis, and he's going to go ahead and share his screen and get started.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. Well, hey, welcome everybody. I'm so excited you guys could be here. And again, always grateful to be able to provide information to, our families in the area about standardized testing and what that looks like and the myriad of options that students have to, take these different exams at different times. A lot has changed in the last year, given, COVID and the pandemic, and want to be able to, of course, share with you some of these updates. If you have any questions, we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A session at the very end. So you guys are welcome to, enter in your questions into a chat. Jessica, if you don't mind, if there are some questions that you can answer in that chat that come up, feel free to do so as well. And any questions that I can help answer, I'm happy to take questions at the very end of the presentation. But again, really appreciate you guys having me, and let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share my screen now.
Yep, and like he had mentioned, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box. I'll try to answer some questions throughout his presentation, but then we'll have a few minutes at the end for him to answer some questions live. And then Patrick has so kindly offered to provide his contact information as well. So if there are some questions that we aren't able to get to, he'll be able to answer your questions at a later time.
Great. Jessica, can you see my screen okay?
Yep, you're all good.
All right, ready to go. So historically we've called the score back night. And again, kind of coupled this with the return of PSAT scores to students. And really the genesis of this was, to focus first and foremost on how to help, students and parents gain a deeper understanding of what the PSAT scores mean, how to incorporate those scores moving forward, and what can we be doing, or what can we as students be doing to use these scores to help ourselves prepare for this upcoming test. So without further ado, kind of jumping in. So the PSAT in general is very much used for 99% of students as simply a diagnostic SAT. It's meant to provide an early indication of how students are scoring. Colleges do not get these scores. This is simply used for students and their own sole purpose to help understand how they're scoring on this SAT equivalent exam early on, and help give some indications on where they can be, preparing and focusing on their energy as far as the test goes. It's normally offered to both sophomores and juniors in October. This year, because of COVID, I know many schools took their PSATs in January as well. It's generally shorter than the SAT and does not have an essay. So if you're thinking about what are the major differences between the PSAT and the SAT, the PSAT is just slightly shorter. It's about 10 to 15% shorter than the SAT, and it does not have an essay. That being said, again, the PSAT score is meant to be a good indicator of your future SAT performance, meaning if you took the PSAT in January of sophomore year and scored an 1100 total, that's meant to indicate to students that an 1100, that's what their SAT score would be at that time if they took the SAT as well. Again, students should take advantage of the PSAT as a unique chance to practice in conditions that simulate the SAT. Again, students who take the PSAT seriously often feel more confident when they take their first SAT. Again, sometimes I have questions or speaking with parents on a daily basis. We as an organization tend to use the PSAT scores as kind of a baseline score to understand how the student is performing on the SAT coming into any preparation. And often parents will tell us, hey, I don't think my son or daughter took the PSAT very seriously. And while that's understandable, we always want to encourage our students to take it seriously, because that's the best way to get that most important, useful data from the PSAT scores themselves. So again, if you can, definitely take it seriously. And we always encourage students to sit for it. It's just a great example and a great opportunity to get some testing under your belt that really is just simply a practice test. There are basically two section scores, much like the SAT. The evidence-based reading and writing, or what we can also consider the verbal side, or the verbal score of the PSAT and the SAT, that makes up one half of the scores. The other half of the scores are a math score, and the math score is made up of two math sections. Again, another slight difference between the PSAT and the SAT. The PSAT scores are slightly different. The SAT scores anywhere from 200 to 800 in a given section. The PSAT tweaks their scores slightly and a little bit lower, meaning the scores themselves are 160 to 760. So technically you cannot get a perfect 1600 on the PSAT. The best score possible you can get on the PSAT is a 1520, which would be two perfect scores of a 760. Why they do this is a good question. They've never actually come out and said officially why they do this. But what we can gather and surmise is that they want students always knowing that there's room for improvement. So even a 1520, wanting students to continue to engage with the test, continue to grow the test in an effort to get to that 1600 mark. I mentioned earlier that the PSAT is very much a diagnostic and a practice test for 99% of students. When I talk about 99% of students, the 1% of students that it may not necessarily be a practice test for are students who can score high enough to be considered national merit scholars. You may have heard about national merit recognition in the past. All national merit scholars are based on the PSAT scores. So again, the generally top 1% of scores will qualify for some type of recognition, whether it be just recognition itself that students can put on their college applications. There's also often scholarship monies that are offered and available to students who score high enough on the PSAT. This slide here really just kind of shows how they come up with the selection index. I'm not going to go through everything here specifically, but this is again going to be shared with you, and you can use this slide to try to indicate or understand how they came up with that national selection index. But again, to be clear about this, the national merit recognition, I can tell you personally firsthand in my own career, and I've been working with students on the SAT for about 15 plus years now. I can tell you that I've had students go to a variety of amazing schools, whether it be Stanford or Ivy Leagues or Duke or Northwestern, again, some really, really top tier schools. And these students aren't necessarily national merit scholars. So it's not a prerequisite to get into some of the best schools in the country. It's certainly a great honor and a great recognition. And again, another reason why students should take the PSAT very seriously. But, again, if they don't get the PSAT scores that they're thrilled with, it's not the end of the world. And again, I would tell any student that, that's not going to be a barrier to getting into some of the top schools in the country. Again, you could see here, just based on previous PSATs, about 50% of 1.6 million students will score high enough to qualify them for recognition. So I imagine that Los Altos and Mountain View high schools will have a good number of national merit scholars. They're very talented students there, of course. And it's a great opportunity to try to, flex those testing muscles if you can. So that's the PSAT. Again, the PSAT in a nutshell, it's very much a diagnostic SAT. It's meant to kind of provide students an opportunity to simulate a testing environment, but not actually have, the test, quote unquote, count for much. Again, schools do not have access to the PSAT. This is meant, exclusively for students in their own preparation. Now, this pivots, of course, now to the SAT. This is where, you will be sending in certain scores to schools. Just like the PSAT, there are, again, two different sections. You've got the reading and the writing section. That's made up of one section or one test of reading, 65 minutes, 5 passages, 52 total questions. This is very much about, reading comprehension, understanding themes and main ideas within, passages, understanding the tone of authors, very much reading between the lines. The author says this without saying it, those types of questions. The writing and language test is the other section of that reading and writing score. That's 35 minutes, 44 total questions. That's much different than the reading test. Think about the writing and language test much more along the lines of a grammar, punctuation errors, sentence structure, cohesiveness, style. This is much more kind of the grammar rules and punctuation rules sort of aspect rather than reading comprehension per se. So again, those two scores add up and combine to make your reading and writing score, which is again anywhere from a 200 to an 800. Math is the other score. There are two sections of math. And again, just to review, these are in order. Reading is the first section that the student always does. The language and writing test is the next section that every student does. Then they segue into the math sections. The third section and the first section of math, the third section on the test, is a smaller 25-minute section without calculator. That's 20 questions. Again, 25 minutes, 20 questions without a calculator. And the second section, or the fourth section in total, second math section, is a 55-minute section with calculator, 38 questions. Math in general on the SAT covers everything up to trigonometry in your Algebra 2 class. It is not testing your pre-calculus content knowledge. It is not testing your calculus knowledge. It's really predominantly Algebra 2, geometry, algebra questions, a lot of data analysis questions, questions that are dealing with kind of different averages and arithmetic components. Again, it's really everything through your Algebra 2 course and up to your Algebra 2 course. Lastly here, there is an essay. The essay is given at the very end of the SAT. It is an optional essay. And again, how they score that, they have two readers, read each essay, and each reader will give a score from 1 to 4 on 3 different subsections within the essay. They're going to give us, each reader is going to give a score of 1 to 4 based on how well the student read the prompt and understood the prompt. They're going to give a score from 1 to 4, how well the student analyzed the prompt and the analysis within their essay itself. And they're going to give a score from 1 to 4 on how well the student was actually did in writing the essay. How, what did they use? Good punctuation, good grammar? Was there flow? Was there, connections between paragraphs? Things of this nature. This is a side score. So again, when you think about the SAT as a classic score, you think of that 1600 perfect score. Again, that's your reading and writing score. That's your math score. Those are the two scores combined. Again, this essay score is optional. It is not part of your 1600 score. It is 50 minutes. And one major thing to communicate today is, and we'll talk a little bit about some changes that came out this past January. One of the things that the College Board announced, which again is the College Board, of course, is the governing body of the SAT, PSAT, APs, etc. The College Board came out in January and said that the last essay administration will be happening this coming June, and then there will be no essay moving forward. So there will be essays again on the remaining SATs this semester, and then after June, that essay will be, eradicated and will be removed from the test. What the SAT test? Again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. The evidence-based reading and writing section tests your reading comprehension and your ability to find and fix errors in passages that are written especially for the exam. The math section tests your skills in arithmetic, algebra, algebra 2, and geometry, as well as your ability to carefully break down and understand complex questions. Lastly, here, the essay tests how students demonstrate reading, analysis, and writing skills by producing written analysis of a given text. Again, the essay, just to kind of expand on that very quickly, the essay is asking students to write an essay on an essay. The essay that they're given might be a speech from a founding father or an article from a literary magazine of some kind. It's usually a persuasive essay, and their job is not necessarily in the essay to agree with the prompt, yes or no, but to be much more focused on understanding the author's argument and going into detail to analyze how the author makes his or her or their argument in that process as well. The ACT, this is the other test that you're going to encounter that's very comparable to the SAT. Again, the SAT, just to talk a little bit about historically, the SAT has been around a lot longer than the ACT is. I think the first SAT was given in the 30s or 40s. And it actually, I believe, started as a military assessment test to begin. But over time, it really grew to be a standardized test that students would take in to get into colleges. The ACT, came to be a little bit later. I want to say it was in the 50s and 60s, and originated in the Midwest. So historically, the SAT has always been very much a coastal test. The SAT has always been dominated by students as far as who takes what on the East Coast or the West Coast. And the Midwest has historically been dominated by the ACT. When I graduated high school in 1999, I had vaguely heard of the ACT, but I didn't know anybody who was taking the ACT. It was exclusively the SAT for us at that time. But of course, over years and over the past years, with so many students applying to so many different types of schools across the country, the SAT and the ACT have very much become interchangeable as far as what colleges are looking for. Meaning, every day parents are reaching out and asking, my students applying to X school, should they be taking the SAT or the ACT? And the answer is, it doesn't matter what school they're applying to. No schools are going to accept one versus the other. It's really about what's going to be the better fit for your student, and ultimately what is going to be the better score for your student. So you can be able to compare SAT to ACT scores in an apples to apples fashion. And ultimately, when we're coaching and working with our students to identify best next steps, oftentimes we're using diagnostics and other, pre-preparation data to identify and understand exactly what is going to be that better fit for that student, and helping support that student in that test that's a better fit. So again, it's not about what schools want, it's about what your better score is going to be, SAT versus ACT. And there is a lot of overlapping content between the two tests. At the same time, there's some major differences between the two exams as well. And I'm going to go over both the similarities and differences today too. The ACT, there are 4 multiple choice sections, and they're always in this order: English, math, reading, and science. Again, there's just one math section, not 2, like the SAT. Each section is out of 36. So again, a perfect score in each of these sections is a 36. And the overall or composite score is the average of your 4 scores. So it is also out of 36. The average of 4 scores, they will round up at 0.5s or 0.75s, meaning if a student got a 29.5 as the average of their 4 scores, that does round up to a 30. A 29.75 would also round up to a 30. Unfortunately, a 29.25 would round down to a 29. So again, you're always going to have integers as scores. You're never going to have a decimal as far as your composite or section score on the ACT. The ACT, what does it measure? The ACT assesses educational development and readiness to pursue college-level coursework in English, math, natural science, and social studies. One of the biggest differences between the ACT and the SAT is there is a science section on the ACT. And students often will hear science and they'll say, no way, I'm not taking the ACT. I don't like science in school. I want to take the SAT. And what we have to explain to them, and what I would explain to all students and parents today, is that you could have never taken a science class in your entire life and get a perfect score on the science section. So the science test is in fact not testing a student's background knowledge or ability in the science fields or their science classes. What it is it's giving students random charts, tables, and graphs, and some studies and some experiments to go along with those random charts, tables, and graphs, and then asking students to go back and find answers based on that information. So it's not, again, testing that background knowledge, it's more randomly giving charts, tables, and graphs, and asking students to extrapolate the correct information from that data to successfully answer those questions. So it's a lot more problem solving than it is necessarily, memorizing the anatomy of a bullfrog or the periodic table of elements, so to speak. So again, when students hear that science test and automatically kind of turn off about the ACT, I would definitely want to make sure they understood that don't freak out about the science section. Again, you could have never taken a science class in your entire life and get a perfect score on the science section. Again, 40 questions, 35 minutes, and it's a test that measures the skills required in natural sciences. As I mentioned, interpretation, analysis, evaluation, reasoning, and problem solving. So kind of talking a little bit about the SAT versus the ACT. So if I was going to, first of all, highlight the similarities, the major similarities are the math sections are pretty comparable. The two math sections on the SAT are very similar to the math section on the ACT. In fact, when we're working with students in either section, the information and the material that we're working through, the strategies and techniques that we're working through between the SAT and the ACT math sections is almost identical. I would say if I was going to get real nitpicky, the ACT has a bit more of an emphasis on geometry in the math sections, and the SAT has a slight emphasis and a bent towards Algebra 2 on the SAT math sections. But other than that, they're still structured the same way, meaning what you should also know about the SAT and the ACT. The SAT and the ACT math sections are the only sections in either test that are in order of difficulty. So when students are attacking these sections, especially high performing students, they want to kind of race through the easier questions in an effort to get to the end of the section quickly and give themselves more time. But in doing so, they'll often make careless mistakes. They'll often make silly errors. And those could be killers to math scores. So when we're coaching our students, we're really coaching them on really working methodically from front to back on the math sections in particular, making sure that they're being very accurate and detail oriented. And of course, yes, do we want to get the very last questions right on any math section? Of course, but we also appreciate and recognize that those are the hardest questions, and that may not necessarily be where our scores are made. Our scores are probably made in the easier and medium questions kind of to that point. So it's important that students don't rush through the math sections in particular, because they are in order of difficulty, and we want to make sure we're getting, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, before we worry about the harder stuff. But again, math is very similar. Another major similarity between the ACT and the SAT, the ACT English section is almost identical to the SAT language section. Again, they're really testing the same grammar rules over and over again. They're testing the same punctuation rules, sentence structure rules over and over again. That is another major similarity between the two. So those are the two similarities, or the major similarities there. The major differences, as I mentioned, there is a science section on the ACT. There is no equivalent on the SAT. That is by far the biggest difference. Another major difference is the reading sections. The reading section on the SAT, the curriculum and the passages themselves are much more difficult. I would put them at the level of a freshman in college, literary course or literature course. Again, these are more challenging passages that are not the easiest to read. It also is a situation on the SAT reading section that very rarely can you go back and find answers word for word of the material. You really have to have a deep understanding of the reading and the main ideas and the themes that are going on in the passages themselves. Those are the more challenging parts of the reading section on the SAT. Probably the good news about the SAT reading section in comparison to the ACT reading section is that you have a lot more time to work through the SAT reading section. In general, the pace on the SAT in all sections is a much more comfortable and slower pace for students than it is on the ACT. I was talking about the SAT reading section. Again, the passages being more challenging, more difficult, the inability to go back and find your answers word for word, and the absolute requirement to understand the deeper main ideas to answer some of these questions. The ACT reading, on the other hand, the passages are easier to read. They're more at the level of a junior in high school, as opposed to a freshman in college like the SAT. you can, in fact, go back and find a lot of your answers word for word. It almost becomes somewhat of a treasure hunt for students to be able to go back and find some of those answers word for word. By far, the biggest challenge for the reading section on the ACT is how aggressively paced that section is. It's a very, very fast-paced section. And in general, the ACT is a very fast-paced test in comparison to the SAT. So the ACT is a lot more straightforward in terms of the way it presents questions to students. It's a lot more straightforward in the way that it phrases certain things. It's not trying to trick students nearly as much. But again, by far the biggest challenge for the ACT in many respects for most students is how aggressively they have to work through these sections. So again, those are kind of the major differences. Again, another reason or another distinguishing factor to determine what might be a better fit for students, SAT versus ACT, if your student is very strong in math, and math is by far their strongest subject, right away I might point you to the SAT, just given the simple fact that half of the scores are math on the SAT, and math on the ACT only makes up a quarter of the scores. Vice versa, if your student is, math is more challenging for your student, it's not their strongest subject, and it's oftentimes one of the more challenging subjects for your student. In that case, I might direct you towards the ACT because, again, math is only 1/4 of the score. So if you're not a strong math student, which is understandable, at least you can dilute that math score amongst 3 other scores in the process as well. Again, those are kind of the major differences. SAT more challenging, but more slower paced and more math centric. ACT more straightforward, almost feels quote unquote a little easier for students. That doesn't mean that they're scoring better, but the questions themselves feel easier. They're getting a higher percentage of questions right, but it's a lot faster pace, and a lot of students struggle with how quickly they have to work through the ACT, and that becomes a barrier there. So again, it's almost identical. The SAT is more logic and reasoning based. The ACT is more content based. Again, the SAT is more math based, and the ACT is more reading comprehension based. Most students actually score pretty comparable. So again, about 75 to 80% of students will score comparable on one test compared to the other. However, there are a good number of students that score dramatically better on one test versus the other. How do you figure that out? Well, honestly, first and foremost, it doesn't have to be an either or situation. We have had many students in our organization's career that have chosen to take and prepare for both the SAT and the ACT, and that's not crazy in the sense that, keep in mind, most of the content and most of the strategies a student learned for the SAT are directly applicable to the ACT. So you're not starting from scratch. You're preparing for one test and then pivoting to the other. In this case, you can probably just do a few additional kind of sessions here, quote unquote, to focus on the major differences. But if your student doesn't want to take both tests and really truly wants to think about one versus the other, the best way to approach this is to take some diagnostic tests, to take a practice SAT, to take a practice ACT, to see how those scores compare, and to also see how students feel about one test versus the other. Again, those tests might come back comparable, but maybe they really like the format and the form of one test versus the other. And again, I'm a big believer that if the student's going to be doing the work and putting in the time and energy into preparing, we certainly want to give them ownership on what they're deciding and what they're focusing on as far as the test is concerned. But again, diagnostics are great ways. And just so you guys know, we're always happy to host any number of students for free diagnostics. We hold practice tests virtually every weekend for our current and prospective students. So if you have a student who wants to take some diagnostic tests coming up, definitely let us know. So that's the SAT, that's the ACT. Hopefully I gave you a little bit of background on the differences and the similarities here. Want to kind of segue into what is going on with colleges now and how are they viewing the SAT and ACT scores. A lot has changed since COVID. And I think one of the biggest changes to the college admissions process, since COVID happened is somewhat of a de-emphasis on testing. I'd be the first to tell you it's been very challenging here locally in the last year for students, simply for the fact that these tests keep getting canceled. And it's only recently that students have been really able to successfully sit and take these exams. And of course, with all the increase in vaccines and schools opening up, and hopefully continuing to look ahead to a return to quote unquote normal days, we're anticipating more and more of these exams going off without a hitch. But it certainly has been challenging in the last year that these schools have been, or these tests have been, canceled sometimes a day or two before, just based on COVID. So because of that reason, a lot of the current senior class and certainly we're applying to colleges that didn't require tests that normally they would. Again, this current class of 2021, COVID hit, last March. The March SAT of 2020 was really the first test that was affected by all of this. And that current senior class was really left with, especially here in California and locally here, left with very few options on how to be able to take those tests. So colleges took that into account, obviously greatly loosened the restrictions and requirements on what these test scores and how they're utilized, because knowing that not every student had the same opportunity to take them. The current junior class, again, a lot of those schools have maintained that test optional or even test blind approach to the admissions process. But again, we shall see how that kind of unfolds after COVID hopefully kind of ends and the pandemic ends and we're back to normal. Again, more and more colleges are going test optional, which allows students to send in their scores, but it does not require them to. There are also a good number of schools that are currently test blind. So the UC system, for example, announced shortly after the pandemic hit last spring that they were going to go test optional for 3 to 4 years with the hope of creating their own suite of assessments to replace the SAT and the ACT. Shortly thereafter, based on a court ruling, they decided to go test blind for the class of 2021. And if I'm not mistaken, that is still currently, as of right now, the current situation for the class of 2022 for the UC system. What test blind means is you can send in their scores, but they're not going to look at your scores in any way. They are looking at the application without scores. So that is what test blind means. Again, test optional, meaning you can choose to send them in, but they're not required. Of course, schools that are test blind or test optional are obviously going to put more value on grades and other factors. Now, all this said, when talking specifically about test optional schools, all we're hearing more and more from many college admissions offices is they are still continuing to encourage students to take these exams to strengthen their applications and show their competency and proficiency on these exams. Yes, they are now optional, but especially if you can do well and score well and strengthen the application, colleges are encouraging students to do so. We are certainly encouraging our students to consider continue taking these exams to strengthen their applications. Especially if you have a good score, it can only help you. Now, obviously, if testing is not a strength of yours and it's something that has always been a challenge or a bugaboo for a student, they can take solace in the fact that they can be applying to many schools that are not going to require them to take these exams. But again, for students who can be, show strong scores, who can be successful in these exams, we are strongly encourage those students to take those. Historically speaking, how do these scores kind of, how are they utilized? Grades and coursework is still by far the most important part of an application. And again, I think this will probably be increased even more and more. So you hear a lot about high school rigor, grades, courses, et cetera. That is going to make up a significant portion of the competitiveness of that application. Again, SAT, this is a Freudian slip here. SAT subject test scores 30%. Just a quick note, I'm kind of going off track here slightly. SAT subject test scores used to be a big part of the admissions process. And then I mentioned they came out with some recent changes in January. One of the changes was that they eliminated the SAT subject tests effective immediately. So in January, out of the blue, the College Board dropped the SAT subject test altogether. So of course that changes a lot for students on how they want to move forward and plan on applying here. Lastly, essays, recommendations, extracurriculars, these will continue to play a role in that application process. I always try to use the UCs as a great indicator of what scores mean and what scores are applicable for what schools. Generally speaking, we're all fairly familiar with the different types of UCs. I would highlight early on, and this is again the fall of 2020. You see Berkeley and UCLA; those are by far the most competitive UC schools. You could see this is a 25th to 75th percentile. You can see the averages are really high for these scores. Again, 75th percentile being a 1540, 1550 on the SAT. Again, 35s as 75% percentile for the ACTs. Quite remarkably high scores. You can also see another major tenet of the UC system is very high GPAs. They reward students with really high GPAs, even more so than most other schools. So again, you can see the range of different schools. I always put Berkeley and UCLA as kind of that top tier. I would say the next tier, Davis, Irvine, San Diego, Santa Barbara, all fairly comparable there. The next tier after that, you've got kind of Santa Cruz and Riverside. And again, last but not least, UC Merced, the newest UC school. You can see there's pretty dramatic differences between the average scores of UC Merced students and the average scores of a UCLA student. But again, all great schools. I myself am a UC Davis graduate, so go Ags. But you can, again, use this as an opportunity to kind of see where your scores lie now and what might be some realistic goals moving forward. Here are some SAT test dates for the upcoming 2021. The most recent one being March 13th. We've got some coming up May 8th, June 5th, and then again, a bit of a break over the summer, and then August 28th, October 2nd, November 6th, December 4th. We'll talk a little bit about testing timelines here, but wanted to kind of highlight here, generally, most students take their SATs or ACTs for the first time in spring of junior year, and then use the fall or summer opportunities to retake whatever they choose or want to do to take again. Most students take the SAT or the ACT 2 to 3 times as part of the process. And there's a reason for that. Number one, most students tend to increase their scores over time. And so, yes, can a student get a good score in the fall of junior year? Of course. And do we have a lot of students prepare and take the SAT or ACT in the fall of junior year? Absolutely. But they're even more likely to get even better score in the spring of junior year. And so there's really no rush necessarily to take it early on in fall unless you are scoring exceptionally high, and there might be an opportunity to take it one time only, knock it out of the park, and put it to the side and de-stress the situation a little bit for you as a junior moving forward. So these are the SAT dates. These are the ACT dates. Again, 7 SAT dates in a calendar year, 7 ACT dates in a calendar year. They are never on the same date, so you technically could take all 14 if you want to. That's not my recommendation, but knock yourself out if you want. But again, ACT, February, April, June. There is a July date for the ACT, which is kind of fun for a lot of seniors who want to retake it again. And I use the term fun very loosely there, of course. And then you've got September, October, and December. Wanted to take a quick moment to talk about AP testing. So I mentioned earlier, with the elimination of SAT subject testing as of January 2021, AP testing has taken on an even greater importance in the college admissions process. The AP testing is now the only standardized test that one can take to show their proficiency or aptitude in a given subject. Yes, you can show your proficiency and aptitude on the SAT or ACT, which are much more generalized tests, but there's only one test now that you can take to show how strong and your knowledge is and how proficient you are in US history, for example. The AP exams are now the only standardized tests that demonstrate a proficiency in a specific academic subject. One of the big things that we hear a lot from college admissions officers and folks who kind of head that up for different colleges is they are really looking at increased academic rigor. They want to see students taking challenging academic courses. Yes, they also want to see students being successful in those academic courses, but they don't want to see students getting 4.0s with the easiest classes. They want to see students challenging themselves. And the AP exams and the AP courses themselves are certainly a major focus and a great opportunity to increase that rigor. And again, students are being encouraged to take more challenging classes. I would say one of the major themes to take away of today's talk is to really kind of look ahead and think about that increased rigor. Are there some AP classes that students can challenge themselves next year at their local schools to begin to kind of show their depth of rigor in their coursework? The AP testing, by the way, it's given during 3 different testing periods this year. Normally it's just given during 1 testing period, but because of COVID, they're opening up and giving it in 3. The first one is early May, second one is middle of May, and the last one is ending in early June. Some of these windows of testing allow for online testing. They actually started doing that last year. They had kind of a truncated AP test for the spring of 2020. It was more like an hour in length, just because of the challenges and the lack of time to make any major changes to the AP testing due to COVID. Now they've had a whole year to prepare and get ready for this, and so there are again, different opportunities to take them online or take them at your local school. There are 30 different AP exams, so there's a ton of different options for students. And again, we talked about increased rigor, maybe some opportunities to really, find some classes that they both enjoy and can really both show off their talent. Again, popular exams: Calc A, B, and BC, computer science, biology, Spanish, chemistry, physics. There are 3 different levels of physics, AP physics tests, literature, US history. These are just a handful of the more popular AP exams. I included some more here as well: world history, statistics, econ, macro, and micro. Again, just a good indication on the plethora of options the students have. Kind of wrapping things up today, focusing on testing schedules for juniors. I mentioned earlier, generally speaking, juniors should be taking their SATs or ACTs for the first time in spring of their junior year. That allows them to get even more curriculum, more content under their belt junior year. Everything they're learning in school is helping them be more successful in these exams. So there's a reason why, by default, we don't point to September of junior year as the first time to take the ACT. We probably would point to April in a vacuum. Now, again, every student's different. There's no one right testing schedule. But if I was to put kind of a cookie cutter approach together, thinking about, what works for the majority of students, it's that spring time to take the SAT or ACT for the first time, possibly retake it one more time in the spring, and then maybe a third time in the summer or fall, etc. Again, there are some schedules that make sense and some that don't. It's important to think about your students' extracurriculars, meaning if they play varsity basketball, the February ACT is probably not a good time for them to take it because they're already, very busy with school on top of their, varsity sport. It may make sense to take a little bit before or wait till June of that junior year to give them some ample time to be out of season there. Again, as a general rule, all students should take the PSAT in October, take the SAT or ACT at least once in junior year, and then retake any test that they need to from July to December senior year. Here's a minimalist approach. Again, PSAT in October, take it one time in the spring, potentially one time again in the summer or fall, and be done with it. This is more your normal approach. Again, PSAT in October, SAT in March or May, or ACT in April or June, AP exams in May or June. Again, we do encourage students to try both exams to see what's a better fit and retake whatever one is the better fit as a senior. And again, use that summer and fall of senior year to retake whatever is necessary. Lastly here, intense approach. Again, for ambitious students or recruited athletes. Those recruited athletes often need to take those SATs or ACTs a little bit sooner, a little bit earlier in the process than their cohort. Oftentimes those recruited athletes need to show some of their prospective college coaches those scores to identify if they're in the window that they can work with at school. Oftentimes, again, they'll take those exams as recruited athletes in earlier in the fall. But again, intensive approach, ambitious students, recruited athletes, SAT or ACT earlier on in the school year, AP exams in May or June, probably taking the SAT or ACT at least one more time before summer of senior year begins. And then, of course, retaking the test one more time if necessary, again in August, or ACT in July or September, depending on those previous results. Yeah, again, a shameless plug here. We are always excited to work with as many students as we can, and would love the opportunity to help any of your students in any way. We do a lot of test preparation, as I mentioned, and we do also a lot of academic tutoring as well. So we do SAT, ACT, AP test preparation, academic support throughout the year. We have 2 different Los Altos offices, one near downtown Los Altos and another more in the Loyola Corners, Fremont Avenue area. We also have a Mountain View office as well. And thank you again for allowing me to participate. I really appreciate it. I'm always excited, and we are always excited as an organization to be able to just be great resources for our local parents, whether we're working with you or not. We care about our local students and want to do everything that we can to support them in any way, and just are incredibly thankful to Mountain View High School and Los Altos High School for the opportunity to speak with you all about the different testing timelines and hopefully demystify this whole process just a little bit more. I'd be the first to admit I do it for a living, and it can be very confusing, and we just love to be resources in any way.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. So I do have some questions for you.
Yeah, of course.
The first one is, for the SAT, we saw that the essay is optional. How is the essay used in the admissions process? Does a quote unquote good essay help? And does a quote unquote bad essay hurt?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, it used to be the case with the SAT essay that depending on the school, they would require it or not require it. And the UCs were one of the main holdovers that was still requiring the SAT essay just to the point before they started making it test optional, now test blind. So, if you can still take the essay this spring, and if you're a junior taking it, I think it's great to take it. I don't think it can really hurt you. Occasionally have a student who's done an exceptional job on the multiple choice sections of the SAT, but maybe didn't score as high as they would have hoped on the SAT essay. Honestly, I don't really think that's something to worry about. I would certainly refer to you, Jessica, and others, for any additional guidance there on that front. But from what we see, it's much more important to have a stronger 1600 score than any essay score. And again, part of the reason why they've eliminated the SAT essay as part of the test itself starting after June is that there are so many different other opportunities that students will be writing essays to get into their respective colleges, whether it be their personal statement or other essays that are going to be accompanying part of that application process.
Thank you. And then someone asked about their PSAT scores, like when they were being released. I believe they are already released. Your student should be able to check their account to see what their score is.
Correct. Yeah. So the College Board, everything is accessible through the College Board. This is where you're going to be able to sign up for any SATs moving forward. This is where you're going to be able to access your AP scores if you ever do take an AP test. So if you haven't already created a College Board account, you can do so for free. And once you have that, you should be able to locate your PSAT scores in that student account.
Thank you. And then someone said, I did look at a few colleges' websites. They said they don't take the PSAT score. Most of the top 30 schools don't. Can you elaborate what type of schools would take the PSAT?
I don't think anybody takes the PSAT in general. Again, it's it's just a diagnostic score for most students. I mean, schools don't get that. It's not part of the application process. That's what the SAT score would be for. Again, the only thing that would factor into college admissions as far as the PSAT score is concerned is, as I mentioned, if you score high enough, if you're a 99 percentile scorer, you could qualify for some recognition, which of course you can then, put down and highlight on your admission or your application.
Thank you. And then someone said PSAT score of 1450, 99% not high enough to get merit award. Is that correct?
That's going to be really close. Again, they don't announce the national merit right away. Those national merit recognitions will actually oftentimes come out early fall, if I'm not mistaken. So a 1450 PSAT score is a very strong score. Again, I would put it right on the cusp of being potentially recognized for that national merit. So fingers crossed there, of course.
And then what is being removed in the future? I know you mentioned the subject tests.
Yeah. So as of now, I mean, the subject tests are gone. As I mentioned, the essay will be gone after June. And then that's it for right now that is being eliminated altogether. I think some potential changes down the road that we may see to some of this is there's been a big push, of course, especially during COVID, to try to make these exams virtual. So students can be able to take these exams at home under, of course, proctored conditions, et cetera. The ACT, for example, internationally has been giving out the test online for years. So for whatever reason, they haven't rolled that out yet here locally or in the United States, but we're eager that will happen and hopefully be able to, open more doors for opportunities for testing for students. But as of right now, the only thing that's dramatically changed is the elimination of the subject tests and the elimination of the SAT essay.
Okay. And then someone said, when I took the SAT last weekend, my SAT had 5 parts. We did the reading and writing along with math, with and without calculator. However, at the end had another randomized section that was one of the 4 components. Is this normal and how is it scored? The PSAT, as far as I recall, didn't have this section.
A great question. So what that is an experimental section. So oftentimes they will use students who are already taking the SAT exams as opportunities to beta test and a lot of these other material that they're working through as an organization. So that fifth that extra test or that extra section that you took, that will not be factored in or part of your 1600 score. So if there was a section that felt much different than anything else, I certainly would encourage students to always do their best in those experimental sections, but that experimental section will not factor in or be part of that 1600 score. You're more than likely, the first 4 sections will be exclusively what your score is based on.
Okay. And then is a calculator allowed on the math section of the ACT?
It is. So there is no it's the only section of the ACT that you're allowed to use your calculator, but honestly, it's the only section you should need to use your calculator. There are some very, very basic calculations that one needs to do on the ACT science section. But you should be able to almost do those in your head pretty simply. They're not, challenging calculations. So good question. The ACT math it always allows a calculator.
And then when colleges say quote unquote optional, that means that they will look at your SAT score if you submit it, correct?
Correct. And again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about look, if you can score, if your SAT can be a strength and your scores can be a strength of your application and, and really make you even more competitive compared to, the other students applying, absolutely you should do it. It's only going to help. And again, you can look at the average scores for a given school to see where your scores may fall and see if that helps determine what might be a better fit or what a score should be to use for that application process. But yeah, I mean, optional, it's very similar. The UC system used to say the SAT subject test, for example, were optional. And what we took that is, look, if you want to be competitive at the UCs, and again, this is, don't want to confuse anybody, this is a couple of years ago, but our philosophy was, if you want to be competitive, you should be taking every test that is quote unquote optional at that application. Now, the only reason not to send it in or to take the test is if your scores are going to be really low and they're not going to help you out.
Okay. And then does any test use weighted score on questions?
No. So that's a good question. And again, every question is worth the same amount of points within that given section. So the harder questions aren't worth more points and the easier questions aren't worth fewer points. They're all worth the same amount of points.
And then can you explain why SAT is slow paced and ACT is fast paced?
No, I can't really explain. I mean, it's just the way the tests are structured. And I think, I kind of prefer that they have both ends of the spectrum there, because it allows students the opportunity to really kind of pick and choose what's going to be the better fit for them. I can't tell you the rationale or reasoning behind it, but I can tell you it does give some students some great options to pick and choose what is going to be the better fit.
Sorry.
Okay.
And then for lesser performing students, how harmful are SAT/ACT scores in the college resume?
For lower performing students?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Again, there are the theme of the de-emphasis of testing was happening long before COVID happened. This has been kind of a movement that's going on for a while, and to be honest, a lot of it has to do with equity and equality among students, making sure that students all have the same types of access to given things, and so. Again, that's really been one of the major themes behind the move to be test optional. A lot of schools, and so again, there are a lot of really fantastic schools that really place a very, very small, if any, emphasis on testing. So if you are a student who is a great student, really strong in your courses, but testing just isn't your thing, that's totally okay. And now more than ever, you're going to have as many great options as possible, much more than many years previous. They've made a major push to really, de-emphasize testing in a lot of these schools.
Thank you. And then what PSAT scores are considered for merit scholarship? My results weren't very clear.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, again, there's no cutoff. It's actually based on the state. And unfortunately, we have a lot of strong students in California, or fortunately, whatever way to look at it. So a score from, let's say, North Dakota, for example, their threshold for national merit's typically going to be a lot lower than it would be in California. But they don't have, again, they don't have an official announcement of, hey, this is the threshold for this year, until after the fact. So if you did qualify for national merit recognition, you should probably find out and know more about that, sometime later this summer, potentially even early fall. That will be announced, and you will be notified.
Thank you. And then can you send in an SAT score to college and omit the essay score if you did badly on the essay?
No. Meaning if you send in your scores, when you send in your scores, you are sending in all of your scores. So one thing, this is a good question and good thing to kind of go over. I don't want to keep us over time, Jessica, but quickly, one of the things that I would highlight is that schools are only going to see the scores that you personally send them. Meaning, you could theoretically take the SAT 10 times and only send in one of those scores to schools. Now, what that being said, you can't pick and choose what specific scores from that sitting you send in, meaning you can either send in all the scores for that sitting, meaning, your verbal, your math, and your essay from that section, or you just don't send any of them. So you can't just send in your 1600 score and not your essay score. But again, if your essay score is not ideal, I still wouldn't use it as a barrier to not send in your scores. I would still personally send them in.
Awesome. So I think we answered most of the questions. There were just a few left. If you had or if you weren't able to get your question answered, feel free to send myself an email, or you can send Patrick an email. If you go to Mountain View, my name again is Jessica Yazdani. So my email is jessica.yazd, D as in David, ANI @mvla.net. And then the college and career coordinator at Los Altos, her name is Laura Duran. So it's LAURA and then DURAN. So first name .Duran @mvla.net. So feel free to send her some questions if you are at Los Altos. And then again, Patrick was so kind to offer his email address as well.
Yep.
So
mine's easy. Mine's Pat, PAT @ajtutoring.com. Again, Pat @ajtutoring.com. And happy to jump on the phone or help answer any questions that you all may have. Again, Jessica, thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate this, and always a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. I hope everyone has a good rest of your week.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody.